currently for 51 Republicans, 48 Democrats, and 1 independent. The new numbers so far, which are not totals, but because some seats are still out there, 53 Republicans, 44 Democrats, 1 independent. And a look at the House now. The House's current makeup, I have at 229 Republicans, 205 Democrats, and 1 independent. The new numbers, as of now, 228 Republicans, 199 Democrats. That's a net loss of 6 for the Democrats. It might even go further than that. And 1 independent. We have 2 people joining us to get into this. Greg Giroux is political reporter for Congressional Quarterly. Greg, beside taking away the obvious ones, what's the story of Congress in the election last night?
Well, for the Senate, it was just a great night for Republicans. They swept the big 5 seats in the Southeast. All of them were open seats presently held by Democrats. They won all 5 of them, and then of course the night was capped by the very well publicized loss of Senate Minority Leader Tom Daschle, the first loss by a Senate leader in more than half a century. That basically elevates the Republicans to 55 to 45. As you mentioned, there are a couple of races that are still outstanding, but the Republicans have leads that I expect will hold up in Florida and Alaska.
The impact of that on the workings of the United States Senate in the next couple of years?
Well, it gives President Bush a strengthened hand to pass his legislative initiatives in a second term. It gets him a few votes closer on things like federal judgeships, passing that energy bill that was stalled in the Senate, a stronger hand should any Supreme Court vacancies come up, and other issues like further tax reductions or maybe even an overall Social Security, overhaul the tax code.
Chris Cillizza is a political reporter for Roll Call. You may remember he joined us earlier this week. Did you have any wrong predictions earlier this week that you need to do a mea culpa on?
Luckily, that wasn't on tape, so no one can hold me to it.
Sorry, it sure is.
I think that we generally had a good sense on where things were going. The nice thing for reporters at this level, when you get this close to an election, is that you see the vast majority of the polls that you see are so close to being what the final result is. As we suspected, Texas was the real center in terms of the fight for control of the House. Democrats lost 4 incumbents in Texas last night. Max Sandlin, Charlie Stenholm, Martin Frost. It was a bad night for them. They had hoped to break even, maybe win a seat or 2 of those 5. They only won 1. So that's a lot of trouble. What we're looking at, if you go through all of the numbers, we're looking at a 2-seat Republican pickup in the House, R plus 2, when this all shakes out. As you rightly pointed out, we're still dealing with absentee ballots, we're still dealing with some late vote counts, but I talked to people on both sides of the aisle this morning before I came in, and they said this is going to be a Republican plus 2 pickup.
We're going to be talking about Congress, the House, and the Senate, and that's the ticket that you need to get on in this hour. We're not going to be talking about the presidential race. We hope you will talk about your members of the House and members of the Senate. Phone numbers at the bottom of your screen, 202-737-0002. If you voted for Senator Kerry, 202-628-0205 if you voted for President Bush, and 202-628-0184 if you voted for any other. Let's start with the leadership in the Senate, if you would, besides what was obvious with Senator Daschle. Anybody else that's going to change?
Well, there's going to be a big fight for obviously there's going to be a new Senate Democratic leader, and we fully expect it's going to be Harry Reid, Daschle's assistant. When Tom Daschle was thinking about seriously running for president in late 02, early 03, Harry Reid was quietly kind of corralling the votes he needed in the event that Daschle was going to run for president. So I think Harry Reid will be the next Democratic leader, and Bill Frist still has 2 more years and will have a strengthened Senate majority as the leader of the Republicans.
Does Harry Reid have any opposition, you think?
We're reporting, hopefully by now it's already on the web, that Harry Reid has announced that he's going to do this. He is as Greg pointed out, he's the odds-on favorite here. I think the one other person to watch is Chris Dodd from my home state of Connecticut. He has shown an interest in leadership before. I think it's an uphill fight for him, only because Harry Reid has really done a massive amount of legwork in the lead up to this election, including donating $1 million to the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee in the last couple weeks. money certainly doesn't buy you the minority leader role, but it buys you a lot of goodwill among your colleagues who in those last couple weeks were looking for funds to run their races. So Reid is in, I think, the stronger position, but don't rule Dodd out, I guess, at this point. But Reid is certainly, as I just said, moving forward quickly. I believe that he's already spoken to Senator Daschle about the fact that he is going to announce that Senator Daschle is, acknowledging that he has lost. So
now, we would tell you that the numbers that you just saw on your screen as Chris was talking were the senatorial numbers for both of those candidates. They were both up for re-election. They both won overwhelmingly, so that's not something that they have to worry about for another 6 years.
And the one interesting point with Harry Reid is that Harry Reid in 1998 was in a race that was decided by 428 votes. He beat the then Congressman John Ensign by 428 votes in the closest election in 1998. Republicans were unable to find somebody this time, despite that close margin, were unable to find somebody this time to challenge him, and he won much, much more convincingly. Connecticut is an increasingly Democratic state. We were never particularly worried about Chris Dodd.
House leadership?
I'll tell you what, it's a victory for Tom DeLay any way you slice it. Mr. DeLay, the majority leader, was no doubt the face of Texas redistricting. He put himself out. He got very involved in the Texas redistricting process, in which they went in, after recapturing the State House in 2002, they went in and redrew the lines in 2003 with their Republican majorities to elect Republicans. Republicans picked up 4 seats in Texas alone. That doesn't even count the fact that prior to last night, Jim Turner, a Democratic congressman, retired because he had no district to run in, and 2 other members, Democratic members, lost in primaries. So you're seeing a massive turnover in Texas, and so I think, if anything, this is going to firm up Republicans' loyalty to Tom DeLay as somebody who can deliver.
Minority leadership in the House of Representatives, nobody lost. Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, Robert Menendez, Bob Matsui, all stay the same?
Yeah, among the House leaders, I don't cover that very rigorously, but I don't see any sort of big change there. There's definitely going to be some soul searching, though, to figure out how to make more races more competitive. I think the big failure for Democrats running in the House campaign this year is that they didn't put that many seats in play. They just didn't have an opportunity to make substantial gains at all.
Who's going to get the finger of blame for that?
Well, I think that privately, House Democratic members knew that this was coming. I know publicly, Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee Chairman Bob Matsui said, we can win back the majority. Well, John Kerry can win Ohio, but he's not going to. So it's statistically possible, but if you look at the actual numbers, it was almost impossible. I think that while Pelosi and Matsui will certainly bear some of the responsibility for this, most people saw this cycle as a long shot in terms of them taking back the House. I think most people see this as a 4 to 6 year plan. I don't anticipate anyone challenging Nancy Pelosi because they lost 2 seats.
Let's go to Philadelphia first. Hello.
Hello. How you doing?
Just fine. You're on the air, sir. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm I guess I would have been described in the 80s as a Reagan Democrat, and I would say today I probably put myself in the Republican Party without any apology. For example, here we had a congressional seat just north of Philadelphia, Bucks County, and the Democratic Party decided to make abortion the #1 issue, where they were going to defeat the Republican candidate, who was a fellow by the name of Fitzpatrick, who ran on a very strong pro-life plank. And Ms. Schrader was handily defeated. My only suggestion to the Democratic Party, being a former Democrat and somebody who worked very hard for the great Governor Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, is that they have moved so far to the radical agenda of the social engineers and the abortion industry, the gay marriage issues. They are attacking the fundamental cores of Western civilization, and they're no longer going to be a majority party. People like myself are leaving, and we're not coming back.
Thanks, caller. He was talking about the 13th district in Pennsylvania. That was a 12-point division.
Yeah, there were a number of races in Pennsylvania, in that southeastern Pennsylvania area, Philadelphia, that were very close. The 13th district was where Joe Huffle was leaving. He ran for the Senate in a race that never really got started against Arlen Specter, where Mr. Specter won pretty comfortably. The race to replace Mr. Huffle was good news, actually, for Democrats. State Senator Allison Schwartz did win. She beat ophthalmologist Melissa Brown, who had run in 2002 against Huffle and done pretty well, but I think learned the wrong lessons. Huffle didn't do as much as he could have done in that race, so Brown came a little bit closer maybe than the district would lead you to believe. The other race in this area in Bucks County that the caller was talking about is an open seat where Jim Greenwood, one of the more moderate Republicans in the House, is leaving. He left very late in the process after filing had already closed, excuse me, after the primary had already ended. And what happened is Mike Fitzpatrick stepped in, conservative, choice of Rick Santorum, who is a growing power in Pennsylvania and nationwide. Democrats had this woman, Virginia Schrader, as the caller mentioned, who this was not a race they were targeting. She was running against Mr. Greenwood, but not a race that they were targeting. By the time everything sorted out, they decided that they were going to stick with Ms. Schrader, despite the fact that they kept the possibility open that they were going to try and recruit someone else in now that it was an open seat. Democrats were hoping, as the caller referenced, Democrats were hoping that this race would be decided on the abortion issue. These are suburban Philadelphia voters who have supported Mr. Greenwood, who is pro-choice. It didn't work out that way. Whether or not abortion was an issue, I'm not sure, but Mr. Fitzpatrick won pretty comfortably.
When you go back into the Texas races and the members who lost, some of them having been there such a long time, Charlie Stenholm, Martin Frost, is that going to have an impact on some of the issues? Like Mr. Frost had been on Rules Committee, Charlie Stenholm had been on Agriculture, I think, for a long time.
Well, I think with the case with Stenholm and also Max Sandlin, who lost by more than 20 percentage points, you're starting to see, and coupled with a lot of the retirements you saw outside of Texas, like Ken Lucas in Kentucky, Brad Carson running for the Senate, you're starting to see a continued winnowing of a lot of the moderates, especially on the Democratic side. I think you're starting to see a House and even to some extent a Senate that's more where the Republicans are conservative and the Democrats are liberal. We definitely saw a winnowing of a lot of moderates in the House in Tuesday's election.
Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, won 68% of the vote yesterday. Next call is from Chicago. Good morning.
Good morning. I happen to be one of Barack Obama's state Senate constituents, and he won his race even more substantially.
Yeah, 70%.
70 to 27. What we're really watching here is the real representation of actual core values represented by Mr. Obama, as opposed to those of, for example, Alan Keyes, because even Mr. Keyes, who refused to even concede the race, by the way, in spite of his disadvantage, before Mr. Obama spoke, cannot acknowledge that he has been, in fact, thoroughly rejected by the constituency here in a core Middle America, Middle West state, the state of Illinois. And I think there's a misreflection. I'm a computer programmer, and I can tell you with some insight that some of the numbers you're looking at are, let us say, apocryphal.
Thanks, Chicago. A Senate with Barack Obama.
That's right, and one of the very few bright spots for Democrats in the Senate election. There was no suspense here. The only suspense was how much Barack Obama was going to win by. We wound up winning by 43 percentage points. When you combine one of the best candidate recruitment stories in the Senate election with one of the worst, you get to Illinois. Just a big struggle for Republicans. Barack Obama had star quality ever since that keynote speech at the Democratic Convention, but one of only two. Illinois was one of only two seats where the Democrats took a seat from the Republicans, the other one being Colorado, whereas the Republicans took 6 seats away from the Democrats. So Illinois was a rare victory for Senate Democratic candidates.
And one quick note on Barack Obama, as Greg rightly pointed out, the margin was all that's in doubt. If you had any doubt about Barack Obama being elected, the fact that he was in Kentucky campaigning for a Democratic candidate, Dan Mangiardo, 2 days before his own election, that seems to provide sort of evidence that they were pretty comfortable that he was going to win.
Rising Sun, Maryland.
Hi, my name is Sharon. My question is for Ohio. I know we haven't called Ohio because it's a difference of 135,000 votes, but yet in Pennsylvania the difference is about the same. Do we know how many provisional ballots are in Pennsylvania that haven't been counted?
Caller, that is a presidential issue. We will see if our guests know anything about that. But really, we're trying to stick to congressional. Can you help
I
her?
think the reason that you see Ohio not called yet and Pennsylvania called is because the networks are looking at demographics in each of these states, and what they see in Ohio is that there are enough provisional ballots from certain areas, from Democratic areas, that they're willing, that they want to hold off. And this is also, again, a reflection of 2000, when we saw the networks burned by calling Florida too early. They're going to wait a lot longer than maybe they even need to at this point in order to wait and call it. Pennsylvania, obviously what they are looking at in terms of the demographics of the state tell them that no matter what happens on a provisional ballot or absentee or anything like that, that John Kerry will have carried that state. The same is not true in Ohio.
Speaking of Ohio, we haven't talked about George Voinovich. He's coming back to the United States Senate.
Yeah, that's right. One of the many safe races on the Senate ballots this year. I think he probably won by about 30 percentage points or more.
I'm not sure. I'm going to look here. Go ahead.
Long time political fixture in Ohio politics. Former Cleveland mayor, former governor, and he had a legitimate Democratic opponent, Eric Fingerhead. He used to serve in the Congress, but certainly he was overmatched, underfunded to take on a political titan like George Voinovich.
You were close, 28%, 64% to 36% for Mr. Voinovich. West Palm Beach, Florida, Kerry supporter. Good morning.
Good morning. We're hoping that the absentee ballots will definitely be counted. And I do have a question. Have the overseas ballots been brought in yet?
The overseas ballots?
Yes.
Does anybody know?
Go ahead.
Those are largely military ballots. They are bringing them in now. In Ohio, it's what could be as much as a 10-day process. Frankly, I think John Kerry and his advisors are aware of the political reality, which is that even if 90% of these provisional ballots are counted, and that is a question. Many of these ballots can be invalidated if only because someone had voted somewhere else, they weren't eligible to vote. Even if he wins 80% of these ballots that are outstanding, he still comes up short of President Bush. So the writing, I believe, is on the wall here, and I think we'll get an announcement from him today.
Now, some people may think this is tedious, but there's something to look at in the House of Representatives every time we have this election, and that is what happens to the committee chairman. Why are committee chairmen important?
Well, they set the agenda. It's they accumulate seniority, and they have the ability to set the agenda. We're going to see. I'm not as familiar with the House changes as I am with the Senate, but in the Senate, we are going to get a new Appropriations Committee chairman, Tad Cochran, taking over for Ted Stevens. But that's basically the pinnacle of power. Committee chairmanship.
And in the House, no chairman lost.
No chairman lost. The one big change that you're going to see is because when Republicans came in 1994 on a reform agenda, they put in self-term limits on committee chairmen, which means that Bill Young from Florida, though he did easily win re-election, he will be term limited out. So we have a fight to replace him. There are three people in the race. It's going to come down to Jerry Lewis from California and Ralph Regula from Ohio. That appropriations, they're the people who decide how much pork goes where. That's obviously a really important slot, perhaps the most important committee slot. As you mentioned before, the interesting thing on the Democratic side is that you had two ranking members on key committees lose in Martin Frost and Charlie Stenholm. Martin Frost on rules, which essentially creates the rule that governs each bill, which is it's a behind-the-scenes committee, but a very important committee. And on the Agriculture Committee, obviously voters in West Texas, where Charlie Stenholm was running for re-election, rejected his argument that his seat in an ag-friendly district, his seat on the Ag Committee was crucial. They elected Randy Neugebauer, who had just won a special election in June 2003, one of the least senior members in Congress, they elected him. So you're going to see changes at those two committees on the Democratic side. But on the Republican side, we didn't see any committee chairman fall.
And clarification as to the next person who would be those ranking members. Is it sometimes the next person in seniority?
Yes. In both of these cases, I believe you will see the next person in seniority get it. That is not always the case, especially on the Republican side. We saw in 2002, Tom Davis, who had chaired the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee for 2 cycles, he got a slot on the Government Reform Committee chairman, a spot that he very much coveted. Even though he was 7th ranking member among Republicans. So seniority is the guiding light most of the time, unless there is a particular reason that a certain member who is next in line isn't going to get it.
So I'm using my cheat sheet here. The Agriculture Committee would be Colin Peterson
Correct.
of Minnesota, and I think I wrote down earlier, Louise Slaughter would
On
be
rules.
on rules.
That's correct.
Let's go next to Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina. Go ahead, caller.
Good morning.
Morning.
First of all, I'd like to say that I really enjoy the Washington Journal, and I feel like from all the networks, you guys are the most unbiased in your presentation of what's happening on the political scene. And my comment was the Senate and the Congress race, when we look at the map that you guys have been showing as far as how the country has voted in the presidential election, it's showing the majority of the country is in red. And I feel like that's being reflected also in the other elections. It's the voice of the people saying these are the issues that we feel are the most important. And the Republican Party is the party that is representing the majority of what the people of America want.
North Carolina, I'm going to ask you a question that I asked one of your state mates earlier today when he called in, and that is, how does this happen? That a state like North Carolina goes 56% for President Bush, 52% for Republican I'm sorry, what's
Richard Burr.
Richard Burr.
Yep.
Richard Burr, and then turns around and gives 55% to a Democrat in the governor's seat, Mr. Easley.
I don't know. I think Mr. Easley's a good man. I didn't vote for him personally, but I just feel like he had a lot of confidence because he has done economically had made some strong choices and took some strong stances as far as economic problems North Carolina was facing. So I feel like probably people wanted to give him a chance to finish what he had started.
Okay, thanks. How does this happen? What do you think?
Well, with the Democratic governor getting reelected, the governor's races are a little bit different. It's not really an apples-to-apples comparison to the federal races. There's a different issue matrix at work here. The governor's in charge of budgetary issues, and Easley was operating from a position of strength as an incumbent. You had, obviously, President Bush with 56%, and certainly that was a boost to Richard Burr, as we mentioned, one with 52% of the vote. One thing I would mention about the caller talking about just all these areas in red, his area of the South, I was just running some numbers, and if you take the 13 southern states in the United States and 26 Senate seats there, after today's results, you have 22 out of 26 Senate seats in those 13 southern states held by Republicans. 25 years ago, it was 19-7 Democratic. So we're starting to see the Republicans solidifying their hold in the Southeast.
How many years ago was that?
25 years ago.
So 25 years it took to make that change.
Right. It's basically, among those 26 Senate seats, the Republicans in 25 years have netted 15 seats in that region of the country alone.
And another point, and Greg brought this up earlier, and I think it's an important point when you're looking at Bush winning the state, Burr winning the state, and Easley winning the state. Candidate recruitment still does matter. Richard Burr started off slowly, but what he did well was he raised a massive amount of money that he held until the end and used to make sure everyone knew that Erskine Bowles, his opponent, the Democrat, had been Bill Clinton's chief of staff. Bill Clinton is not a particularly popular figure in North Carolina, and that mattered. In the governor's race, I think what you saw is Patrick Ballantyne, the Republican nominee, was just not that strong. He was just not that strong a candidate. I do believe that Mike Easley, if Republicans had recruited a very strong candidate, could have been in some trouble given these numbers. I mean, clearly people were very comfortable voting for Republicans on the presidential and the Senate level, but when the other candidate running for governor is not as well financed or doesn't have the sort of candidate skills, then they're going to go with who they know. They're going to go with the incumbent, as Greg said. So candidate recruitment does matter. Despite all the money that's spent and all the media and the coverage, who the candidate is and how they connect with people still matters.
Is this the Mike Easley that was in Congress?
No.
No,
No.
it's not. Thank you for that clarification. Hazard, Kentucky. Go ahead. Hazard, Kentucky.
Oh,
Good morning, Kentucky.
good morning. I'm calling from Hazard, Kentucky, hometown of Dan Mangiardo, who nearly upset incumbent Senator Jim Bunning. I wanted to make some comments, just my feelings and observations. I feel like that Daniel, well, of course, I think he's a fine young man. I feel like he ran a positive and upbeat campaign. I feel like that just like Senator Obama, of course, Senator Obama had a lot more people behind him in Illinois, but I feel like that Dr. Dan Mangiardo, we're just very proud of him here in Hazard, the campaign that he ran. And I feel like that positive, upbeat campaigning pays dividends regardless of your party. And I know I realize you have to point out differences, like between Senator Kerry and President Bush, but a lot of negative campaigning just seems to backfire and blow up in your face. And I feel like that may have been what happened to Senator Kerry. Even though I was for Senator Kerry, I really don't understand the fascination with failure, which is my little statement regarding.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Mr. Bunning comes back to the United States Senate. What does he bring any baggage with him after this election?
Jim Bunning is becoming the master of the close win. In 1998, when he won the open seat, it was by 6,700 votes. He won 51-49 with a much wider 20,000 or so vote margin this time. He doesn't leave all that much room for error. I think Greg can probably better address this, but I do think Jim Bunning this is a near-death political experience for Jim Bunning. There's no question about it.
Yeah, Bunning's political history is very interesting. As Chris mentioned, winning the second closest race in 1988. Harry Reid had the closest. And I think it was probably over 2 years ago, Bunning was expected to have this battle of the titans between himself and Democratic Governor Paul Patton, who a couple years ago was a dominant political figure, two-term governor, and then he withdrew from the race because of some personal problems. And Bunning looked like unstoppable for a moment. And Dan Mangiardo, this is a race that really closed late, only in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and Mangiardo really struggled for most of the campaign to raise the money. He got an injection of funds late in the race, but too little, too late. But as Chris mentioned, I mean, Jim Bunning's 20,000 vote margin seems like a landslide when you compare it to 98.
Go ahead.
One other quick thing to note about Kentucky is Jim Bunning clearly has George Bush to thank this morning. George Bush won that state, and in the last 2 weeks, Jim Bunning basically ran everything that he talked about was myself and the president versus Dan Mangiardo and Senator John Kerry. So if you're voting for Dan Mangiardo, then you're voting for this Massachusetts Democrat for president. So he made it clearly a referendum on the president. And I think if you look at the 2 House races that were contested in Kentucky, the 3rd district, which is the best Democratic district in that state, targeted every single cycle by Democrats, and Northup, a Republican, again won, showing with 60% of the vote. I mean, that is stunning from someone who usually wins with 52 or 53%, regardless of who the candidate is. And in the 4th district in northern Kentucky, Jim Bunning's old congressional district, a very conservative district, Republicans were a little bit nervous about this one. Nick Clooney, who is George Clooney, the actor's father, the brother of the late singer Rosemary Clooney, he's an anchor in Cincinnati, very well known, very well liked in the state. He looked like a congressman, white hair, impressive. They thought this was going to be very close. It wound up not being close at all. Jeff Davis won comfortably 54-44. So when I saw that, when the Kentucky polls closed, I said, this is not going to be... Dan Mangiardo is really going to have to swim upstream if he's going to win this race.
Easton, Maryland. Good morning, Easton.
I was wanting to comment. I live in Maryland, and I voted definitely for Bush and for Pipkin. However, knowing that what the odds in this state were pretty, definitely Democratic But after growing up in Colorado, living in Texas and Oklahoma, I'm just glad to see that the congressional races, that finally people are finally voting Republican, as far as that's what the people's values. I really, really think that that's what's important to them, and it's just so nice to see, for me being out east, to see that these, especially Colorado, just after living out there and living with mostly Democratic, that it definitely is changing. And I voted for Bush, even though I know that there's some things he's done wrong. I definitely didn't want Kerry in, because I don't think he would have made a good president as far as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Greg Giroux, you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, she mentioned Colorado, and actually was something of a wash, I think, when the election results came in. One of the rare victories for Senate Democrat candidates. Ken Salazar, the state attorney general, narrowly defeated Republican Pete Coors. If the last name sounds familiar, it should be. The famous brewing company. And in the House races, there were a couple of House races that people were really keeping an eye on. For some time, the 7th District, which is in the kind of like rings around the state capital of Denver on the west, the north, and the east. Bob Beaupre was expected to have a really tight race early on with Dave Thomas, not of Wendy's fame. I'm sure he got that a lot, but a county district attorney. But Beaupre really trounced him in that race. The bright side for the Democrats, though, is that they had a rare open seat takeaway from the Republicans in the 3rd District. Huge district, about the size of the state of Florida, where Ken Salazar's older brother, John Salazar, won the 3rd District out there.
I want to ask you a question about competitiveness, and I just will use Maryland as an example, since that last caller was there. I pulled up the Maryland congressional races. Wayne Gilchrist winning at 76%. Dutch, is it Ruppersberger?
Yep.
67%. Ben Cardin, 63%. Al Wynn, 75%. Steny Hoyer, 68%. Roscoe Bartlett, 67%. Tony Salazar, Elijah Cummings.
And that would be a surprise.
That would be a surprise, yeah, at 73%. And Chris Van Hollen, 74%. I mean, those are huge.
This especially, and this is, Greg talked about this, and in the House, what you saw in 2001 was a redistricting process across this country that was aimed at re-electing incumbents, regardless of your party. Look, there are 435 of these men and women up here. When they get together, they say, this is a pretty good job. I like doing this. Do you like doing this? The other person says, yes. So what they do is it's sort of a, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. They draw districts that, as you see in Maryland, are designed, they're very heavily weighted to one party or the other. And that's what we're seeing. By our count, you had roughly 35 competitive House races out of 435. That's 8%. 92% of these races were in the 60-plus range. So,
Taking that one step further, you were talking about the race for the House Appropriations Chairman. I think it was your publication that wrote a piece about how much money from different members of Congress had taken out of their own congressional campaigns and given to those members who are up for that chairmanship. How can they do that?
When you're in the 92% of House incumbents who are not facing a serious race, the leaders of the party, especially the people at the campaign committees, the Republican Congressional Committee and the Democratic Congressional Committee, come to you and say, look, we drew this district for you so that you were going to get elected easily. You have $1 million in the bank. You're going to win with 70% of the vote. We need 500,000 of that to go to the NRCC, the National Republican Congressional Committee, so that we can spend it on these other 35 races. They can do it because the federal election law, even with the passage of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act at the end of 2002, allows an unlimited transfer of hard dollars, federal money, from a campaign committee to a national party committee. So members are a key element in fundraising, much more so than they were in the past, because they have these pots of hard money they're sitting on. In the appropriations race that you mentioned, you saw Ralph Regula, who had never been particularly active in terms of giving money to his colleagues, all of a sudden get very active. And while I'm sure Mr. Regula has the best interests of the party at heart, he also has his own best interests at heart, which is he can go to every member that he gave money to and say, when you were in trouble, I helped you. Now I want this appropriations chairmanship. You need to help me.
Same in the Senate?
Yeah, as Chris mentioned, it's an unlimited transfer of these hard dollars from your own campaign committees to the national party committees. As Chris mentioned earlier, Harry Reid, $1 million. Chuck Schumer was over $1 million.
$2.5 million, Chuck Schumer.
Yeah. And,
so just because somebody gives money to a candidate that they believe in for their campaign doesn't mean that they know that that money will be used in a campaign of that candidate.
Absolutely.
It could be used, they can take it and give it to other people.
That's right.
Next, we're going to go to Kingsport, Tennessee.
Yes, I was concerned. I had read or heard last night that one of the senators elected, I believe he was a physician, had actually called for the death penalty for abortion physicians, and that brought to mind the concern that the Senate and congressional people who were elected were ultra-conservative. And I know coming from Tennessee, Bush and some of the Republicans were painted as the next coming of Christ. I was interested on your comments on the makeup of as far as how conservative they were.
She's talking about the Oklahoma Senate.
Yeah, Oklahoma, big success story for Republicans here. Bush, first of all, won the state by about a 2-to-1 margin, about 65-35, I think. And you're going to have a very conservative delegation in Oklahoma. You have Jim Inhofe, and now you have Tom Coburn. And I guess if I had to think of a couple of surprises I saw, it was probably the margin by which Coburn won. I mean, he beat Brad Carson, who was an A-list Democratic candidate, probably the best the Democrats could have hoped for in Oklahoma, and Coburn beat him by 12 percentage points, despite a lot of the criticisms levied at Coburn, one of which the caller outlined. But 12 percentage point margin for Coburn was a really substantial win.
And if you look at the Republicans that won Senate races yesterday, the caller is right. There is no question that this influx of new members is going to tilt the Senate more conservative. Jeff mentioned Tom Coburn, very conservative member of Congress when he represented eastern Oklahoma in the 2nd District, is very likely going to be a very conservative senator. Jim DeMint in South Carolina, who won an open seat race to replace Fritz Hollings, very conservative record during his 6 years in the House. David Vitter, in the House since 1999 in Louisiana, won in what to me was a huge surprise, won without a runoff, took 51% of the vote, which almost no one expected, very conservative. Richard Burr, who beat Erskine Bowles in North Carolina, a conservative. So there's no question that these Republicans ran on a conservative message. They did not run as moderates. They ran as conservatives who are going to go and push that message in Congress. So I do think that you're going to see the Senate skew a little bit more conservative.
And one other thing, if I might add, about, and Chris is right, the Senate has obviously the reputation of being chummy and clubby or whatever. And I think it'll be interesting to see how people like Tom Coburn and David Vitter fit into the Senate, the modern Senate. Well, they don't have the reputation of being like the go along type. They've kind of gone off on their own a little bit.
Well, Tom Coburn wrote a book in which he blasted Congress.
Right.
He was on book notes and he just blasted them.
And Denny Hastert, the House Speaker, he had some choice words for him too.
For Denny Hastert, it would be interesting to see how he's going to be greeted back by his colleagues. Even
That's right. It's
a
a very interesting roster of new senators we have right here.
It'll be interesting to see how his book does after all this, too. Let's go next to Savannah, Georgia. Hello.
Hi. My name is Susan, and I voted for Bush. I used to live in New York, and I think one thing that has not been mentioned very much is the reason I believe that Bush got so many votes, as well as senators and in the House and the Senate, how the Republicans have taken control of the House and Senate. I think people are more conservative, more moral. Also, I think was a big concern was the fact that you had Supreme Court justices that might have stepped down, and there were a lot of people concerned about the abortion issue, and I know a lot of religious people voted specifically for that and for also the marriage amendment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, caller. Thanks. Earlier this morning, we got a lot of people calling regarding morality issues, Christian conservatives. Did that, if that played out, as some are saying in the presidential race, did it also play out in the senatorial races?
Yes, I think so. I mean, you look at these the Senate races that were won by the Republicans. The southern part of the United States, very certainly maybe economically conservative, but also very socially conservative, especially in the rural areas. South Dakota, and the heartland of the country, also another conservative region of the country. I think one of the things that will be interesting to analyze after all the data are in is to what extent the so-called evangelical, religious vote was boosted over the 2000 election. That was one thing that the president's campaign staff was focusing on, improving over the 2000 election.
Been able to see anything in the House?
I think any time that you see an issue play out on the presidential level, and in exit polling last night, it was interesting on the presidential level, you saw voter concerns, the economy, the war on terror, Iraq, those are all things that we expected to be issues. Moral values was in there as a wild card, which I do think is interesting, and Greg said it'll be interesting to go through and excuse me, look at that a little more deeply. Anytime an issue resonates like that on the presidential level, it absolutely resonates in the Senate, and it even more so resonates in the House. Remember, House races are largely defined by the top of the ticket. These are not races like in the Senate where in South Dakota you saw $40 million spent. These are races where you maybe see $10 million at the absolute most. Now, that's a lot of money to me. I would love to have $1 million, but these races generally, because the amount of money isn't spent on them, sometimes the candidates are not as well known. A lot of people will go in and say, I'm for President Bush, I'm for Richard Burr, I'm for Robin Hayes, a congressman in the 8th Congressional District who has been targeted before. So there's inevitably a trickle-down effect.
Okay, then explain what happened to Phil Crane.
What happened to Phil Crane is that Phil Crane ran for president in 1980. He's been in Congress since 1969, and I don't think many people knew that he was still their congressman. And that's what happened. He hadn't had a serious race in a very long time. As we talked about, competitiveness is definitely on the decline. Phil Crane sat in the most Republican district in Illinois, which granted, Illinois, as it showed last night, giving Barack Obama 70%, the most Republican district in Illinois, no great shakes, but he was in a very Republican district, I think just sort of had it on cruise control. It's what we saw in Pennsylvania in 2002. George Gekas, very comfortable seat. In redistricting, he was put in with Tim Holden, another congressman. The seat was clearly favored Gekas. Holden was more active on the campaign trail. Holden's campaign apparatus had been run out several times before George Gekas's, and he never caught up. Same thing happened with Phil Crane. I think by the time Phil Crane realized he was in trouble, it was too late. His campaign team, his campaign machine, national Republicans tried to move in and help him there, but it was too late. And it was an excellent year in Illinois for Democrats, too. I mean, Barack Obama winning with 70% of the vote. The fact in an open seat race that a candidate would win with 70% certainly does not bode very well for Phil Crane's chances of getting any help from the top of the ticket.
And that opens up a place on the Ways and Means Committee.
It does indeed, and that will be, as always, every member of Congress, we do interviews with them when they come in, and every member of Congress, we say, what committee would you like to be on? And they say, well, appropriations or Ways and Means. So that's certainly a coveted spot.
Great, Jerome.
I was going to add, just to piggyback on what Chris was saying about Phil Crane, I think maybe House Democrats will take a lesson from a race like this, as they maybe did from 2002 when George Gekas lost in Pennsylvania, and that is, you maybe ought to start seriously thinking about challenging some of these longtime incumbents who really haven't been seriously challenged for years and years. As Chris mentioned, your election machinery may get a little rusty. You may take your district for granted. You may not go back there as often as was the one of the chief indictments that Democrat Melissa Bean made against Phil Crane. So, just because an incumbent's been there 20, 30 years, happens to represent a district that votes pretty strongly with the presidential candidate of his or her party, doesn't mean that incumbent is invulnerable.
Did anything come up in the campaign regarding Congressman Crane's announcement several years ago that he was being treated for alcoholism?
No, but inevitably that is a subtext. That is something that is part of the whole package of what Melissa Bean made a point of. Another point that she made, usually, frankly, while committee assignments are extremely important, most voters don't who follow this, they sort of follow, they check in and out, not like Greg and myself. They don't know how important Ways and Means and this and that and the other thing is. But what Melissa Bean did is she said, look, Phil Crane was the most senior member on the Appropriations Committee, on the Ways and Means Committee, he should have been Ways and Means Chairman, but instead, Republican leadership passed him up and picked the much younger Bill Thomas. So the fact that his seniority didn't work for him, he's passed over for the Ways and Means Chairmanship, so his seniority is not effective. And I think the alcohol, it all goes to the same point, which is just that this is someone whose time has passed. This is someone who seniority is not helping the state and who doesn't have the energy to help his constituents. And Bean painted herself as the more energetic candidate.
Neptune Beach, Florida, thank you for waiting. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm calling from Neptune Beach, and I wonder why nobody is talking about the fact that we had computers recording and counting the votes. In some states, the vote was 100% taken by computers. My question to your panel is, do we have groups of experts from each party checking the program that runs these machines?
You're concerned about the actual program that runs the machines?
Of course, yes.
Any thoughts on that?
Oh, not really. I'm not too familiar with the mechanics of the elections in that sense. But I think in state law you'll find that they're pretty adequate safeguards, I would imagine.
And the other thing is, rest assured that both the Kerry and the Bush campaign had plenty of people making sure that every vote that was cast for their candidate was counted for their candidate.
So if anybody's concerned about their computers, they should know that somebody who's on their side was watching.
Absolutely. After 2000, there was a clear focus that we are going to make sure that when a vote was cast for John Kerry, it registered as a vote for John Kerry. When a vote was cast for George Bush, it registered that way. I mean, I think more than any election before, because of 2000, you are seeing the most accurate reflection in terms of the people's will being done.
That was from Florida, and from one hot spot to another, we go to Olmsted, Ohio. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good.
Thank you. My comments are about the congressional race between Dennis Kucinich and Edward Herman. When Dennis ran for Congress, he defeated Martin Hoke, and he asked for a debate, and he received a debate from the incumbent candidate. That was requested of Dennis this year, and maybe being too busy with this presidential run or whatever, he decided he didn't have to do that. And that's something that I think his party should have pushed him into. Even though we're heavily Democratic, everyone wants to see the views of each opponent in a race. And anyone running for office owes that to their own party and the other party. And I found that to be quite disturbing. I mean, he may have thought it might have been a waste of his time because he was pretty much a shoo-in, as he's been for a while. And he is a very hard-working congressman. He does represent the area very well. But I would like to see in the future, if the party is so confident on the voter turnout, that they might consider the fact that he has to debate the issues that the people who are going to be voting for him want to know about.
Chris Cillizza.
I think what you see with Dennis Kucinich and what you see with most safe members of Congress is what's long been called the Rose Garden strategy, referring to the presidential race. They, Dennis Kucinich in particular, are not interested in appearing on a stage with an opponent who they believe does not have the money to run a serious race against them. By doing that, anyone who watches it says, well, this Ed Herman guy, I haven't heard a lot about him, but he's holding his own against Dennis Kucinich. He's doing pretty well. They just don't want to take that risk. Now, whether or not they should is something that I'll leave to people much smarter than I am, but they're not willing to take that kind of risk. And just one other quick note on Ohio, the caller called, it goes back to the lack of competitiveness in congressional races. Ohio was as everyone watching knows, was the centerpiece of this presidential election. We had not a single race in Ohio that was that was one that the national parties were talking about regularly. So you see that even though the state may be competitive on the presidential level, the redistricting in 2001 really is taking effect and being felt here as you saw incumbents across the state be reelected.
2nd District, Rob Portman, 71%. Mike Turner, 3rd District, 62%. Mike Oxley, 58%. In the 4th District, 5th District, Paul Gilmore, 67. It goes on down, 65, 69, 67.
It was a question of whether you got 60 or 70, really.
Yeah.
I mean,
the two big swing states we were watching the presidential race, Florida and Ohio. Now, just to give you an indication of how how strong the Republican advantage is in redistricting in those two states. You would think, maybe at first glance that maybe the number of House seats are pretty evenly divided between the Republicans and the Democrats in those two states. In Ohio, I believe it's 12-6 Republican, and in Florida, where Republicans also controlled redistricting after the 2000 census, I believe it's 18-7, so 30-9 in those two states, even though we're watching them very closely for the White House race.
Fairfax, Virginia. Hello.
Hi, how are you? I'm calling. Hi, how are you?
Fine, go ahead, please.
I'm calling in regards. I live in Fairfax County. I'm calling for the 18 to 30-year-old votes. I haven't seen a lot of aggressive Democratic campaigning out here. I'm from Pennsylvania, and I've lived here only 8 months. And I know with Congressman Green how he cleaned up Bucks County, Pennsylvania so well with a destitute area that was really drug infested. I haven't had anyone come to my door. I've only seen signs in the street. I know that people want to talk about moral values. Moral values are very important. You need a teacher for moral values. You need someone at home. And with our servicemen over in war, it's very hard to have them teaching our children. The young children I viewed out here don't have an understanding of why it's so important to get involved with your congressman. I think the Democratic Party might have brought it on itself if it's a loss.
Thanks. Greg Drow.
I haven't really looked at the exit data, polling data for the 18 to 30-year-old groups. I'm not precisely sure. Maybe I don't know if you've looked at it.
I've not seen it. I think what the Kerry people were hoping, and was certainly a big part of their strategy, was that this 18 to 30-year-old group, these people who got very excited about former Vermont Governor Howard Dean in the presidential primary process, that excitement would carry over and they would vote. There's no question in polling done before the election, John Kerry held a substantial lead among 18 to 30-year-olds. The problem is, and the reason that the caller said that she hasn't been talked to a lot, 18 to 30-year-olds simply do not vote at the levels that people who are older vote. In the 40 to 54 and the 65-plus senior citizens are the most dependable voters, and that's who these candidates are going to go after. They're going to go after the people that they know are going to vote, the people that vote in county elections, the people that vote in federal elections. So until the 18 to 30-year-old group sort of makes its voice heard and reflective of its population, you're probably not going to see candidates focus that much on them. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy there.
She mentioned Virginia. I just want to, maybe I'm burying this point to death, but just to go down, Joanne Davis won with almost 80%, 79.8% of the vote, then 55 for Thelma Drake.
And that was an open seat that Thelma Drake won with 55%.
With 55%, 69% for Bobby Scott. Randy Forbes won with 64%, Virgil Good with 63%, Eric Cantor with 75%.
That's right, another state where redistricting kind of created safe districts for all of the incumbents. I mean, not far from here in the Northern Virginia area, Tom Davis, the Republican congressman from the 11th district, had a strengthened district in the post-census redistricting. So did Democrat Congressman Jim Moran of the 8th district in Arlington and Alexandria, part of Fairfax County. Very, very safe districts, and none of those. I guess every district was decided by at least 10 percentage points.
You mentioned Randy.
Jim Moran was actually the closest, 59. He only got 59% of the vote.
And you mentioned Randy Forbes. I think that's a perfect example of what we're talking about. Randy Forbes was elected in an extremely competitive special election just 3 years ago, and now he's winning with 64% of the vote. I mean, this is another state. Republicans controlled the redistricting process. They drew districts to re-elect these incumbents, and again, you see it in all of those percentages.
Let's go to Brooksville, Kentucky. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thanks.
I just wanted to respond to some of the congressional voting that took place in Kentucky and some of the reasons why I think the races went the way they did. Morality, of course, played a big part. We had the marriage amendment that took place on our ballot, which, of course, passed. And, when you're talking about the abortion issues, that brought a lot of people out to the polls. But one of the major deciding factors for me, like with Davis over Clooney, was each candidate in Kentucky that ran for any office was given a questionnaire of specific questions regarding certain things that took place. And this was published in a paper. Clooney was one of the ones who chose not to respond to the questions, but instead, check out my website, and I think that was important that people said, well, why don't you answer each specific in the way these other candidates did? Instead, tell me to direct me somewhere else where I have to research you. Answer the questions directly. And I think this country, being from a moral standpoint, wants somebody to stand up and take a stand and don't say, hey, you reach out and tell me what I stand for. I'm not going to tell you. And I think that was a big issue with a lot of voters. I know it was for me. If they didn't bother to respond, I didn't give them time of day.
Thanks, Greg Giroux.
Yeah, the 4th District race, as Chris mentioned earlier, 10-point win for Jeff Davis. And very, very difficult race for a Democrat to win, in part because of the presidential vote dynamics in that district. Like Jim Bunning, Jeff Davis is probably very, very happy that he was on sharing a ballot with President Bush. I haven't looked at the district numbers, but Bush won the district by almost 25 points last time. And while I think Clooney tried to emphasize, de-emphasize his ties to the National Democratic Party and emphasize some social conservatism on issues like abortion and gay marriage, for example, I think a lot of these Republican voters ultimately decided, all these Bush voters ultimately decided, why would we vote for a Democrat who is conservative on these issues when we can just vote for a Bush-supporting Republican who's just as conservative, if not more, on these issues?
I'm looking at the Kentucky congressional races. It's all red with one little spot of blue in it, and that's the 6th district right in the middle.
And the 6th district, what's amazing about that map is the 3rd district, as I mentioned before, and Northup, that's far and away the most Democratic district. That takes in Louisville. It's far and away the most Democratic district, and Democrats can just not beat her. The 6th district was a big Democratic win in in earlier 2004, in February 2004. Ben Chandler, who had just lost a governor's race in New Jersey to Congressman Ernie Fletcher. Well, Ernie Fletcher had to resign his seat when he was elected to Congress, the 6th district. Ben Chandler said, well, here's an opening. I'm not doing anything. I should run. He ran. He won in a district that George Bush in 2000 carried by 12 points. So it's not impossible for Democrats to win these conservative southern districts. But as a caller referenced, and as Jeff makes a good point, Greg makes a good point, it's just much more difficult because Republicans can just come out and say, this is what I think. And 9 times out of 10, that's in alignment with the majority of voters in the district. Democrats have to pick and choose where they're going to try and say, I agree with you on this, and de-emphasize almost everything else. So it's a difficult balance.
Juneau, Alaska, hello.
Hello. Yes, I'm nonpartisan, and in the last 50 years, I've voted here, there, and yonder on all, each different parties and so forth. I think there are some issues that you haven't discussed that were important to me in this election. One of them, Tom Daschle, I think, has lost seats for other senators simply because of his leadership of the minority group in the Senate when he filibustered in committees. He wouldn't allow things to go clear up to the floor and did commit. If I remember correctly, that's the first filibusters that have ever been done in committees. When you look at that, you think, if both parties did this, we could be locked up and never get anything done for the next 100 years. Other things that concerned me were the United Nations, which has stepped far beyond its obligations or what its charter allows it to do, and is aiming more and more at a one world where they take away sovereignty from each and every country. Those things are, that is not what the United Nations was charged with. The Supreme Court decisions that have been made when they've come out and justified their decisions in the last few months or years, saying, well, we based partly this on ideas from Europe, or would take in world considerations. That's not what the Supreme Court is charged to do.
Alaska, thank you. Can I ask you who you voted for in the Senate race?
Yes, I voted for Murkowski.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah, I voted with the winning side there, it appears. Last time I checked, it was about a 4 percentage point
49-45
victory there for Lisa Murkowski, and she was seen as along with Tom Daschle as among the two most vulnerable incumbents on the Senate ballot. But it looks like she held on against a very substantial Democratic foe in former Governor Tony Knowles, who won twice statewide there, and actually in some of the polls the last few weeks was running even if not a little bit ahead of the incumbent there. I was struck by the fact that she mentioned the filibusters. And I know that one of the big arguments that George Allen, the senator from Virginia, the chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, was making was if you he was basically, one of his chief arguments was, well, you need an augmented Republican majority to kind of like break these Democratic deadlocks on issues like energy and federal judgeships and taxes for other reasons. And I think that I don't know that I don't know how many voters really respond to Senate internal Senate dynamics like that. But I think ultimately the Senate candidates, Republican Senate candidates, benefited greatly from sharing about with President Bush. Lisa Murkowski being one of them.
And I think the the other point, if there is a state where voters followed and made up some of their minds about internal Senate politics, it was South Dakota, as the caller mentioned. What Republicans did is present Tom Daschle as the chief obstructionist, the person that is blocking Republican President Bush's and other Republican priorities in the Senate. That message really works in a state where the president, he won, I believe, 60% in 2000. I think he won 59% this time. That's a message that really resonates. And I would be very surprised if you didn't see George Allen and some other folks today come out, senators, Republican senators, come out and say, the American people, at least in South Dakota, were sending a very clear message. They don't want obstructionism. Tom Daschle lost. He's the first leader to lose since 1952 in the Senate. This is a message. Democrats need to work with us, not oppose us. I would be shocked if they didn't come out and make that point.
And in fairness to the caller, United Nations, does it come up? Is it an issue? Does anybody care?
Well, people... I think it's part of a huge issue matrix, as the caller mentioned. It mattered to her. I'm sure it matters to other people in this country. It is not the defining issue of a campaign in the way that the war in Iraq or terrorism or the economy or, as we're seeing, moral values is, but it's certainly a concern that people take into account.
We are supposedly waiting for a news conference that might be happening in Boston fairly soon, but it has not started yet. So as you can see there on your screen, an empty podium. So we will just wait. This is the Carrie Edwards Campaign News Conference. We'll try to find out who's expected to speak there. We're going to continue taking a look at the congressional races with our guest in Belleville, Michigan. Go ahead. Belleville is gone. Let's try Beaumont, Texas. Hello, Beaumont.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
I'm in the congressional district for Ted Poe, a judge in Houston who won over Lampin, and there are two really main reasons I voted and got out to vote for Mr. Poe. And I went to one of his rallies, and he explained to me afterwards the devastating news about North Korea. Mr. Poe had stated that in 1994, the Clinton administration had given North Korea 2 light water nuclear reactors. Then that fully armed North Korea with nuclear weapons is what he said. And then, of course, on September 12th, just 7 weeks ago, Madeleine Albright was on Meet the Press, which backed up what Ted Poe said. And then you go back to Chinagate, and I pieced all this together, and Bill Clinton had let all these Chinese agents into the White House, Charlie Tree and John Hong, and of course there could be no prosecution because almost all of these witnesses fled. My bottom line here is I'm beginning to realize, as many people are, that the Democrats have this delusional Neville Chamberlain idea of appeasement, and it just does not work. They're giving away nuclear reactors, Chinese agents in the White House. I can never vote for Democrats again, and I did in about 1980, but never again. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Any reaction?
The callers, that was certainly one of the Poe-Lampson race was one of 4 in Texas where we saw a Democratic incumbent lose. And Greg and I were talking about this earlier. We didn't just see them lose; we saw them lose substantially.
55-42.
Right. When you see an incumbent lose by 13% of the vote, that's a huge margin given how incumbent-friendly voters are. What you had in that district, and the caller talked about it, is it was redrawn by Mr. DeLay to elect a Republican. It included Harris County, the southern part of Harris County, which is the Houston suburbs. It's a very, very Republican area where Ted Poe, who is a district judge who's drawn a very high-profile judge who's with his sentencing. He sort of has some high-profile sentences, making a man convicted of manslaughter in a drunk driving incident carry around the picture of the woman that he killed in his wallet, things like that. So he had a very high profile and had a base in the right part of the district. The caller was calling from Beaumont, which is Nick Lampson's base, actually, in Jefferson County. what happened there is that Nick Lampson's strength in Jefferson County just wasn't enough to match Poe's strength and the Republican turnout in Harris County.
Let's go next to Wayne, Oklahoma.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
This is a bad day for me. I was so hoping that Senator Kerry would win, and I'm even more disappointed, I think, in the election of Tom Coburn here in Oklahoma. This man is totally scary.
Why is he scary, caller?
Oh my gosh, he makes a radical fundamentalist person look liberal. This man is really scary. He has voted against everything. He voted against aid for the people who were devastated in the big tornadoes that came through a few years ago. He's voted against Meals on Wheels for elderly. He's voted against the senior citizen centers. He's voted against everything. And it's very scary, and I'm very disappointed in the people in our state for electing him. My husband and I are at the point where we're actually discussing selling our home and moving to a blue state because we feel so oppressed here. And yes, we are Christians, and yes, we go to church. And I am very tired of being demonized by the Republican Party and categorized as, if you're not a Republican, you can't possibly be a good person. You can't possibly be pro-life. You can't possibly be anything.
Thanks, Greg Giroux.
Yeah, Tom Coburn's victory, as I mentioned a little earlier, was one of the most decisive victories for Senate Republican candidates in this election, a 12 percentage point margin. And the difficulty, despite Brad Carson's considerable strengths and very well spoken, conservative Democrat, Rhodes Scholar, and the like, with President Bush winning that state by about 30 percentage points, roughly 65-35, Brad Carson would had to have run 15 percentage points ahead of John Kerry in that state to pull the 50-50. That's probably a couple 100,000 votes right there. Very tall order for any Democrat.
What kind of doctor is he?
Coburn is a obstetrician.
That's right.
So he's.
Is he the doctor who used to go home and deliver babies on weekends?
Absolutely.
That's right. And he had a few years ago. He had a little, big spat with the ethics committee over how much, over to the extent to which he could keep any sort of a medical practice while he was serving in Congress.
One other point about Tom Coburn, the caller referenced. Tom Coburn made enough in politics statements that would doom almost any other candidate. What I will say about Tom Coburn is, and he showed this he was elected in 1994, he self-term limited himself and left in 2000. He held the most Democratic district in Oklahoma, the Eastern 2nd District that Brad Carson then went on to win when Tom Coburn left. He won it pretty comfortably when he was in the House, and I think we were always watching this. I think that people in Oklahoma say, that's just Tom Coburn being Tom Coburn. He speaks his mind. And I think that, along with, as Greg pointed out, a huge Bush win, trumped their concerns about some of the things he said. He's sort of an anti-politician in that he says things and he said, yeah, I think that. Like it or lump it, I guess, is sort of his attitude. So I think people in Oklahoma, that appeals to them. It appealed to them in the House, and as you can see by his sort of comfortable margin in the Senate race, it must appeal to them there, too.
Chris DeLizza is a political reporter for Roll Call, and he's been at Roll Call since 2001, originally from Marlborough, Connecticut, graduate of Georgetown, and before Roll Call, he covered governor's races and Southern House races with Charlie Cook in the Cook Political Report. And Greg Giroux is in his 4th election cycle as a political reporter for Congressional Quarterly. He covered this year's elections, Senate elections, among other topics. He covered the House in 2002 and also was a contributor to the past 4 editions of the CQ Political Almanac. Hometown, Virginia Beach, Virginia. He went to the College of William and Mary. Gentlemen, thanks very much for coming.
Thanks for having us.
We could have done this another 2 hours, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There is a lot coming up today on C-SPAN. I hope you'll stay with us. In what we're doing right now is we are waiting for the Kerry briefing to begin in Boston. There's the room. As you can see, nobody is there yet. They're expecting Joe Lockhart and Mike McCurry to speak at this, and so that will be happening fairly soon. Meanwhile, back here in Washington, we can show you a picture of what it looks like at the Ronald Reagan building. Now, this is the room and the place where at 5:40 this morning, Andrew Card came out and talked about the fact that the Bush campaign believed that Ohio was statistically theirs. Well, we understand that President Bush is expected to come to the Reagan building sometime between now and 2 o'clock this afternoon. We'll see what happens. We'll just be following that. 10:30, there's going to be a news conference of the Congressional Black Caucus on Capitol Hill. We'll try to bring you that. 11:30 Eastern Time, Senator Daschle will be in Sioux Falls, and we are hopeful to have some coverage of that when he's going to make his first statement since losing his Senate seat. And also, we hope to have a local newscast out of Cleveland to give you an idea about what's going on there in the presidential race. All that coming up. Between them, we'll take your phone calls. Hope you'll stay with us. But now, first, we want to give you an idea of what it looked like when Barack Obama in Illinois last night went before his supporters to